I think I'm kind of drawn to these stories because there's an element of fear in them, and I have suffered with fear my whole life now. I'm not alone there, but it's something that I can really relate to. And David and Goliath is a very well-known story, but unfortunately the world kind of knows it as a sort of a face your fears kind of story, or if you trust in God, I can do anything, which is not. But it is a fairly giant story, if you'll pardon the pun, so we need to jump straight in to get through it. So I know you were going to read, Paul, but I have to go through it bit by bit. That's okay. So 1 Samuel 17. There are things we want to watch out for as we go through it. First, we want to see how the whole story points to Jesus. The whole Bible points to Jesus, Old and New Testament, like all 66 books, written over 1,500 years by 40 plus authors, all telling unique stories and all pointing to Jesus in different ways. And second, we want to see what God can teach us. And we want to remember that the people in this account... Did I forget, Grace? The kids have to go to kids' church. Okay, kids, you can go with Grace, go to kids' church. Well, if that's the only thing I forget today, we're doing good. But we want to remember that the people in this account, they were as ordinary as you and me. They had the same fears and they had as much to lose. So I'm going to read and narrate and take us through the story as best I can, and you can read through with me or just listen. So our story starts as the battle lines are being drawn up between Israel and the Philistines, and the tension and fear in the air before the battle would have been intense. This is life and death, and to lose means death and slavery. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and King Saul and the Israelites the other, with the valley in between them. Now war is brutal in every age, but we have hospitals and doctors and antibiotics, and these men didn't. Slowly dying from a scratch was as likely as dying from any wound. So often, to save bloodshed and countless men's lives, a fight between two champions was proposed instead of a battle involving all the men. Now the Philistines had this in mind for this battle, and it kind of helped that they had an ace up their sleeve, Goliath. Now when Goliath walked out, it was as if death itself had taken on a body and stood in front of the Israelites. Nobody had ever seen anything like him. Verse 4, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits in a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armour of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. 6 cubits and a span. Goliath would have stood at 9 feet, 9 inches. Now I'm hoping if we can see him, these next images will help us. This is Robert Wadlaw. So Robert Wadlaw was 8 feet 11. There's a full picture, if you can make it out. And Bible skeptics used to think 9 feet 9 was an exaggeration. But Robert proves it. But unfortunately, Robert was a very ill man. So though he had the height, he wouldn't have been able for warfare. So Goliath was in a different category. Here's Mr. Olympia 2012, Phil Heath, standing at 5 foot 9 inches. Phil would have stood 6 inches taller than the average Israelite back in the day. So he'd be closer to King Saul's height. If he was fitted with armour, he'd make a formidable warrior. However, at 212 pounds, he would have only weighed similar to Goliath's weapons and armour. And that's how we know Goliath wasn't just tall, he was strong. He was heading into battle carrying the weight of Phil on his back. Now the next picture, this is where we really start getting perspective on who Goliath was. So there's the same guy, that's Phil, and on his right shaking his hand and somehow making him look small, is renowned strongman Brian Shaw, who stands at 6'9", weighing 430 pounds. Now you can imagine Brian in full armour facing an average Israelite who was nearly 2 feet smaller than him. And Brian is a big man. Still 3 feet smaller than Goliath. So this Goliath has been a warrior his whole life. It's his identity. And due to his size, he's been trained to kill and strike fear into the hearts of any who stand in front of him. He's the undefeated champion of the Philistines for a reason. So when you picture Goliath walking to the front of the Philistine army, towering above everybody, armed to the teeth, covered in armour, and looking like something from a nightmare story, the blood of King Saul and his army ran cold. Goliath inspired terror in all who looked at him. This man was dead. So verse 8, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let's fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. There's no answer to this challenge. I can feel the fear in the ranks of the Israelites and the hush that fell over the whole army. And as ordinary people, we know that fear and we know the paralysis it can bring. These men were frozen in fear. This Goliath defies a whole army and there's not a man can face him. More, in his arrogance, he insults the God of Israel. And still, no one steps forward. This is where the story starts to get a bit familiar, because God was about to send a shepherd to fight a fight that nobody else could. Someone who didn't look like he was expected to look. Someone who didn't conform. And it starts to sound awfully like the story of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. So we read on. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem. It's verse 12. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. Firstborn was Eliab, second was Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take a ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of your unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines." Now, David's resume is not that of a warrior or a champion. In fact, it's almost the opposite. We learn he's young, and I've looked into this, and somewhere between 13 and 15 is probable. The youngest of all his brothers and far too young to go to war, so he looks after his father's sheep. He's also a cheese delivery boy, a messenger boy, as the young used to be up until not so long ago. Now verse 20, early in the morning David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out, as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawn up the lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies. He ran to the battle lines and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Can you imagine how terrifying a presence Goliath would have had to make veteran soldiers run from him on sight? At verse 25, now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." Now David caught wind of some of this talk. And he asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Now this is David's genuine reaction, that not dealing with Goliath was a disgrace to Israel and an offence to the Lord Almighty. And he wasn't running his mouth, but it may have sounded like that. They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." Now enter David's oldest brother. Verse 28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." David's reaction seemed to cause a bit of commotion among the men, and his oldest brother was quick to try and cut him back down to size. He let everyone know he was a big-mouthed sheep herder who was full of himself, with absolutely no right to be there. And David stood his ground in typical younger brother style. Verse 29, "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. And then, verse 31, what David said was overheard and reported to Saul. And Saul sent for him. Now I wondered why Saul sent for David. And I think it's for the same reason his brother got so mad at him. David was making them look bad. He was saying out loud what they were trying so hard to hide. He was calling it an absolute disgrace that Goliath's words and challenge were not dealt with. And whether he meant to or not, he was pointing his finger at the king and every soldier there, highlighting the shame that they felt. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Like, David's only 13 to 15 here. David said to Saul had an opportunity here to step up and be king. And he should have said, "Kid, don't be crazy. I'm the king. I'm Israel's champion and protector. I'll go and fight him." But he didn't. Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." What David said next, again, sounds like boasting, but that couldn't be further from the truth. It was instead an incredible declaration of trust in God and reliance on his mercy. Verse 34, David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." That last line is key, because David wasn't boasting in himself or his deeds. He knows the only reason he's alive is because God saved him from the lion and the bear. He knows he's in over his head. His life is in God's hands. He's at God's mercy. And today, David declared, God is going to rescue him from certain death at the hands of Goliath. Now the whole assembly watching knows that if he faces Goliath, he's a dead man, and there's no doubt only God can save him. Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Now I don't know what thought process allowed Saul to let young David fight Goliath, but we know he dressed him in his own armour. It would have been the greatest of honours to have the king dress you in his own armour. And often when you read scripture, again, something else jumps out. And for me this time it was these next few lines. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put on a coat of armour and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over his tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go on these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. David rejected the armour because he couldn't move in it. Now that sounds simple enough and it's practical, but it hit me hard. And here's why. Can you imagine the peer pressure that he would have felt as a young man with all of these hardened soldiers all around him watching, and with the king watching, to wear the armour that he'd been given, the king's armour? He would have looked the part of any elite soldier. He would have met everybody's expectations, and he would have felt absolutely accepted and a part of this army as one of their own. And that's pretty much every boy's dream come true, and all offered to him on the plate. What amazed me was, after being dressed in the finest of warriors' gear and the king's colours, he put back on his shepherd's clothes. He was happy to be a shepherd again. Happy to be who God made him to be. He didn't need to be someone else. He knew his own weaknesses didn't limit God's power, because God is God. Like, when I think back to all the times that I wanted to be like those around me and to fit in, when I think of all the times I've allowed others to put armour on me so I could be accepted, when I think of all the times I've rejected myself and who God made me to be as not enough, I need to be reminded of David and that God doesn't make mistakes. We are exactly who He wants us to be. He made you to be exactly you, and He made me to be exactly me. Did David know as he spent long days looking after sheep that he was in training? That his time spent alone would not only deepen his faith and trust in God, but it would prepare him to become God's chosen champion? He hadn't a clue. The day he faced Goliath, he was on his cheese run. But even through being a messenger, he was growing. His obedience brought him there. His compassion for his father and brothers brought him there. He did what God tasked him to do that day in all its simplicity. And life is like that. Much of what you and I do every day is ordinary, just daily, everyday stuff. Like David, it's our own time looking after sheep. It might feel empty and pointless, but there's a much bigger reality behind it to be aware of. God's plans. Do we realise that every day, as we go about our routines, that we are in training? Now, you may or may not remember him. Anyone remember Mr. Miyagi in the Karate Kid? Well, he popped into my head. Remember, he had Daniel doing all these meaningless tasks over and over, to wax on, wax off, and sand the floor, paint the fence. Well, Daniel got mad because it felt completely pointless. He couldn't see the bigger picture. He couldn't see that he was really strengthening his body and training his muscle memory to fight, and he didn't even know it. And God does that too with us. It's only when we look back on our lives that we realise God was teaching us and building us up and changing us and equipping us. Nothing is mundane or pointless when it comes to God. Even the horrible times that we go through, He can bring good from it. All of our struggles, all of our anxiety, our illnesses, our fears and weaknesses, all of the long hours doing mind-numbing, thankless work, hours spent studying scripture that feels like it's going in one ear and out the other, all of our talents, the ones we think are too small to make a difference, all of these things, these are what God uses to fulfill His plans and make us into exactly who He wants us to be. I find that absolutely incredible. And David knew God made him a shepherd. He wasn't going to reject who God made him to be. More importantly, he trusted God enough to completely put his life in His hands God was his armour. So he took off Saul's armour and he put back on his shepherd's clothes. Verse 41, meanwhile the Philistine and his shield bearer in front of him kept moving closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome. And he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals. When Goliath saw David was a boy with no armour and carrying only a stick and not a sword or a spear, he was enraged. This wasn't a champion to fight. It was an insult. A boy with a stick. That's what the Israelites sent out to beat him. Was it some kind of weird joke? Well, he'd fix that very quick. In his hatred and arrogance, he saw no threat in David. And that was a mistake. Now I get chills every time I read David's reply. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Goliath, in the eyes of the world, was the ultimate warrior. He had the respect and fear of all around him. He was the pinnacle of warfare. David was a part-time messenger boy who looked after sheep and delivered cheese. Yet David knew something with absolute certainty that no one else seemed to get. This battle was always in God's hands, no matter how unlikely it looked. And he trusted in those hands. Goliath, in all his strength and arrogance, wasn't fighting David that day. He was fighting God. Verse 48, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand. He struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. The Philistines trusted in Goliath. Fierce and strong, all fled before him in terror. He was giant not just in stature, but in everything that he represented. He trusted in his armour and his weapons. He trusted in his own might, declaring himself greater than the armies of the living God, greater than God. Never ends well when people declare themselves greater than God. In David, God used the weakest and least likely of people to display his power, leaving no doubt that it was the Lord who won the battle. Once a symbol of ultimate power and invincibility, Goliath was dead. How do we best wrap this up to take it home? Well, as great as the Israelite victory goes, it was only temporary. Goliath's death pointed to a far greater problem and a far greater enemy, death itself. All of those men on both sides of the battlefield that day, and all of their ancestors before them, and all of their descendants after them, would all die. Romans 5:12 tells us, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. This sin and death would lead to all of us being separated from God and to punishment in hell for all eternity. This is true death. Much like the Israelite army before Goliath, all we could do was stand in fear and await our destruction. It was a fight we could never win. We needed a champion to go before us, to fight for us, to rescue us. In his abounding love and mercy, God sent his only son Jesus to be that champion. David, he faced a giant warrior who represented death. And God saved him. Jesus would face death itself and take the full punishment of hell in our place. All to save us, to pull us from the fire. This story of David and Goliath, it's an incredible story. It points to the most loving and trustworthy God imaginable and to a Saviour and champion above all others, Jesus. And we must never forget what has been done for us on the cross. What Jesus went through. The real enemies of sin and death that were defeated at unimaginable cost. And in this world too, there will always be Goliaths. Men and empires that shake their fists at God and do terrible things. And they look invincible. But they'll all be laid low in the dust of death. They'll all stand before God and answer for what they've done. And that is a terrible place to be. And I thank you, Jesus, for the mercy we've received, that we'll never face that judgment because Jesus is our champion. And the next time we catch ourselves trying to put on someone else's armour, we'll remind ourselves that God is making us exactly the way He wanted us. For His purposes and plans. And it will always be His power that accomplishes great things. At the end of the day, the only person that we ever need to be like is Jesus. And only God can accomplish that in us. For now, we're in training, and a lot of that is going to look like Mr. Miyagi's wax on, wax off. So don't be surprised when God turns our weaknesses into strengths, because that's His speciality. Story of David and Goliath. It's a good reminder of God's amazing plans, and we see clearly it's His power at work through us. We're not the champion. Jesus is the champion. But we are free to be who God made us to be.